What if a stretch of road held the secrets of dozens, perhaps even hundreds, of missing and murdered women, yet the crimes remained largely unsolved? Along a desolate highway in British Columbia, known as the Highway of Tears, Indigenous women and girls have vanished without a trace, or been found murdered, leaving behind grieving families and unanswered questions. Between 1969 and today, more than 40 cases have officially been connected to this highway, though Indigenous advocacy groups believe the real number could be in the hundreds, as many disappearances were never officially reported or investigated. For decades, law enforcement failed to recognize the pattern. Many cases were dismissed as runaways. Crucial forensic evidence was lost, and families were left to conduct their own searches. But what kind of person preys on the vulnerable along this remote stretch of road? And how has forensic science played a role in identifying the few known killers responsible? Stick around as we take a deep dive into one of Canada's most disturbing and ongoing true crime mysteries, the Highway of Tears, a 725-kilometer stretch of Highway 16 running between Prince George and Prince Rupert, British Columbia, is a lifeline for many small, isolated communities. The region is vast, heavily forested, and sparsely populated, with long stretches of road where cell service is unreliable or non-existent. With little access to affordable transportation, many residents, especially young women, have been forced to hitchhike to get to work, visit family, or attend school. This reality made them easy prey. The first recorded case dates back to October 1969, when 26-year-old Gloria Moody, a mother of two from the Bella Coola First Nation, was last seen leaving a bar in Williams Lake. The next day, her body was found brutally beaten and sexually assaulted in the woods nearby. Despite decades of investigation, her killer was never identified, and her murder became the first in a long, chilling pattern of missing and murdered Indigenous women along this highway. From the 1970s to the early 2000s, a disturbing number of young women vanished, often while traveling alone. Many were last seen walking along the highway, leaving parties, or getting into vehicles driven by strangers. Some of their bodies were later discovered dumped in ditches, wooded areas, or rivers, while others were never found at all. The victims ranged in age from teens to young mothers, their dreams and futures stolen by unknown predators. The victims include Maureen Mosey, 33, last seen hitchhiking near Salmon Arm in 1981 and found murdered shortly after. Alberta Williams, 24, last seen leaving a bar in Prince Rupert in 1989. Her body was found strangled weeks later. Ramona Wilson, 16, disappeared in 1994. While hitchhiking, her remains were discovered a year later. Ayala Sarge Auger, 14, last seen walking along Highway 16 in 2006. Her body was found a week later. The lack of an immediate police response only compounded the tragedy. Many families reported their daughters missing, only to be dismissed by law enforcement. Parents were often told their loved ones had probably run away, despite evidence that they had stable lives and no history of leaving without contact. In some cases, missing person reports were not even filed until weeks later, wasting critical investigative time and allowing killers to cover their tracks. Are you finding this story as disturbing as it sounds? If so, don't forget to hit the like button. It really helps the channel out. For years, investigators struggled to make connections between the cases. The remoteness of the highway, combined with Canada's harsh winters and dense wilderness, meant that many crime scenes lacked witnesses, and forensic evidence was often lost to the elements before police could arrive. Many victims' remains were so decomposed by the time they were found, the cause of death could not even be determined. However, advancements in forensic science have helped authorities link at least some of these murders to known perpetrators. One of the most infamous killers connected to the Highway of Tears is Bobby Jack Fowler, a violent drifter from the United States who traveled extensively throughout Canada in the 1970s and 80s. Fowler, a convicted rapist and murderer, was finally linked to the 1994 murder of Colleen McMillan through DNA evidence, making him the first confirmed serial killer connected to the Highway of Tears. Investigators believe Fowler may have been responsible for several other killings along the highway, given his known predatory behavior and extensive travel history. He was arrested in 1995 in Oregon for kidnapping and sexual assault, and he later died in prison from lung cancer in 2006. Another confirmed killer is Cody Legebokoff, one of Canada's youngest convicted serial killers. In 2014, he was sentenced to life in prison for the murders of 4 women. His victims, including Lauren Leslie, a 15-year-old legally blind girl, were brutally beaten and stabbed before their bodies were discarded in remote areas. Legebokoff, who was only 20 years old when arrested, shocked the nation with his lack of remorse and callous attitude toward his crimes. Unlike other killers associated with the Highway of Tears, Legebokoff didn't just target hitchhikers. He lured victims through social connections and casual encounters before carrying out gruesome attacks. Despite these convictions, the vast majority of Highway of Tears cases remain unsolved, raising haunting questions about whether multiple predators are still at large, using the highway as a hunting ground. Over the years, Indigenous groups and victims' families have pressured Canadian law enforcement to take action, improve forensic investigations, and treat missing Indigenous women's cases with the urgency they deserve. The disparity in law enforcement response to missing Indigenous women compared to non-Indigenous victims has been widely criticized. Many families feel their cases were ignored until public outcry forced the government to act. In 2015, the Canadian government launched the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, a landmark effort aimed at addressing the systemic failures that have allowed these crimes to persist for so long. However, even with renewed investigative efforts, most cases remain unresolved. To this day, the Highway of Tears remains a chilling symbol of injustice, neglect, and the vulnerability of Indigenous women in Canada. Families continue to seek answers, demanding better investigations, expanded forensic testing, and increased support services for those at risk. In recent years, new efforts to create safer transportation options, install surveillance cameras along the highway, and increase public awareness have been implemented. With advancements in forensic genealogy, DNA testing, and digital investigative techniques, will we one day uncover the full truth behind these disappearances? And more importantly, how many more lives will be lost before true justice is served? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And please subscribe for more in-depth, true crime stories.